Thank you to the Hertie for organizing this for Claus. It's a great pleasure, and it's also an honor to be here. And it's also a little bit scary. And the reason it's scary is that in the last 5 years, which is the time I've known Claus, and it's actually most of my academic life, I was trying to think about what our conversations were mostly about, and although they were on diverse topics, migration, borders, global justice, basic income, politics more generally, they all seem to boil down to some interpretation of a famous slogan. And the famous slogan is the one that Gramsci gives at some point, which is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And these exchanges, it seemed to me, they all boiled down to what we made of this slogan, either of us. And I thought that my mission was to try and convince Claus that even though I was with him on the intellectual pessimism, he really should resist becoming pessimistic as far as the will was concerned. So he really shouldn't go down the pessimism of the will option. And I think I've had mixed results. But the reason why it's scary tonight is that I want to, in a way, continue defending that line, to continue defending this sort of optimism of the will. And it's kind of hard to do that in times of crisis for the reasons that we've heard in the previous two panels. One reason it's hard to do it is that you just look around and it's just really bad. So there's not much to be optimistic about. But the other reason is that I have invested my optimism, and I'm not just the only one, actually. What I'm going to be talking about is the result of co-authored work with Jonathan White at the London School of Economics. So I'm not the only fool believing this. But I have invested my optimism in a kind of political agent that seems to be the most discredited political agent around now, which is the political party. So I want to kind of be a good Gramscian all the way around and all the way down, and so endorse the optimism of the will, and also endorse the idea that there is something very valuable for democracy in the political party, but most importantly, in the kind of civic engagement that underpins the political party as an institution, and so what I'm going to call political partisanship. So what I really want to talk about and try and argue about and defend is the idea that there is something really worthwhile in democracy about political partisanship. And I'm going to define and give you some more distinctions in a moment. But that we would lose something really important in losing partisanship, and that we would also lose one of the possible sources that we have in trying to reason about how we get out of a democratic crisis of the kinds that we have been discussing. And so it's a little bit scary because I'm going to argue that despite the fact that a lot of the empirical evidence suggests that we should actually just abandon parties, that all these horrible things have been happening in the last few years as far as partisanship is concerned, and we heard a little bit today some of the more pessimistic diagnoses. But I want to defend this idea that partisanship is important, and I want to start with the kind of Burkean definition of the party, which is a very loose one. It's basically the idea of an association of people, of men and women, that commit to some joint set of principles. And I want to take seriously that idea, that there is something valuable in this organized way of committing to principles, that it's not just about a theorist here and there coming up with principles, and then about citizens individually and separated endorsing those principles, but there's something really valuable about doing it collectively in a certain way, and the certain way is what is embedded in this understanding of partisanship, which doesn't neatly overlap with parties, but certainly is conducive to the party. And what I'm going to talk about this evening is even more specific than that. I want to talk about the contribution that partisanship gives to an answer that has been pressing democratic theory in the last few years. The answer is to a question which is the kind of paradigmatic question in democratic theory. I think Philipp Schmitter mentioned it in his talk. What is the people? So if we follow the sort of mainstream definition of a people, we'd say that a people is the kind of agent to which the exercise of political power should respond if it is to be legitimate at all. And the argument that I'm going to present tonight is that it's very important to attend to the relevance, both normative and political, of partisanship in trying to understand what is the people and how should we go about figuring out what counts as who the power is accountable to, in other words. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that debate in a minute, but first I want to just throw in a few thoughts as to why we think partisanship is a valuable mode of engagement in democracy and why the form of party is a valuable political agent. And so here are three thoughts. It seems to us that for citizens to be convinced in the worth of political agency, there have to be three things, three conditions satisfied. People can be convinced that it's worth engaging with politics if there is a kind of normative source to that conviction. In other words, if we know that ideas matter, and if we know that we have some ideas that might matter. So this goes back to what Claus was saying earlier about doing the right thing. So if we have this normative source, we know that there's some things that we can do about sorting out political conflicts and crises. The second one is what I'm going to call the motivational source. The idea that not only is there a good idea, but that actually people, on the whole, are ready to go and fight for that idea. And that they're not alone in doing it. That there is other people out there who are willing to do it with them. And one then invests in this joint enterprise, and again, that seems to strengthen citizens' conviction in the worth of political agency. So not only do we have an idea, we also have a group of people who are committed to that idea and who are committed in a certain way. They have something to rely upon when they're investing in this commitment. There is a certain shared memory of what they've done together. There is a certain learning process from which they can further cultivate this commitment, that there's something that can invest together in doing. So this is the motivational source. And the final one is what we might call the executive source. Not only do we need ideas, and not only do we need goodwill, motivation, and desire to invest in these ideas with other people, but we also want to know that there is some way in which these ideas and the goodwill that we put in these ideas actually translates into something that then happens when institutions make decisions. And so we need the executive source because we want some way of guaranteeing to ourselves that something can be done with these ideas and with the will of these people. And it seems to me that when we're talking about worth and conviction in the worth of political agency, what we're really talking about is these three sources. We want ideas, we want motivation, and we want executive capacity. And it seemed to us that when we're looking at the various agents in democracy that are possibly able to satisfy these conditions, and if we look at these agents not just as they are in the world and corrupted by the sort of circumstances, by the contingencies of the moment and so on, but if we look at these agents at what they can do when they're at their best, when they're at their strongest form, it seemed to us that political partisanship was necessarily one of the forms that really emerges as one of the most promising to satisfy these conditions. It's promising because what partisans have is a certain idea of the public good and the common good and what one should invest jointly with others. It's important motivationally because what partisanship ensures is that there is a way of catalyzing the efforts of citizens in a democracy and that they can all commit together knowing that there is a shared past and a future, that something that they can do with others. So the motivational source is very important. And there is also executive capacity in the sense that it seems that political partisans know that at some point the ideas that they bring in the public sphere and that they share with each other have a chance of translating into policy proposals, turning into laws, becoming prescriptions, regulations, and so on. So there really is a chance that one can filter good ideas into more concrete stuff that happens, right? So it seems to us that political partisanship is valuable for these three reasons, and that in fact it is paradigmatically valuable. Now the question is, what is one to do in issues such as, okay, parties are important in democracy. Democracy is ruled by the people, and then the question is, well, who is the people? And of course, we had an answer, or at least we thought we had an answer to this question, when we understood political power to be the power exercised by the state, and when we understood the people to be the people that belong to a nation. So there was a very clear correlation for a very long time between these two elements. And of course, that has been challenged for the reasons that we know and for the reasons that we've heard today. So the question is, when we are reflecting them from a more sort of innovating perspective on how should we think about the people given these challenges to conceptions of peoplehood in the nation state, at least as associated with the nation state, how should we think about the people beyond the nation state, or if the nation state is only one element amongst many? Well, it seems that we get two answers in democratic theory. One answer is what we might call the sort of purely normative answer. Is the answer that sees the question of the people as a matter of coming up with a certain set of entitlements that gives us conditions that a body should satisfy to count as being ruled by the same institutions and being ruled by power, being exercised in their name. So it's very much a matter of entitlement. It's coming up with criteria, things that we can think about are necessary conditions that the people should satisfy. And that, in that conception, practical politics, activist politics, partisan politics, is very much a secondary issue. So the priority is to come up with the criteria, to define the set of entitlements under which we should understand who the people must be, and then we just see what happens in a second stage. This is the more normative side of democratic theory. On the other hand, the critique to that normative side of democratic theory is that whatever answer that strategy comes up with, whatever conception of the people, however you understand who the people should be, it will be very difficult for that conception to stand up to the contingency of politics. And so institutions will change, new generations will start taking part of these institutions, new political subjects will join these institutions, and so however we defined people in the first instance will be challenged by the next institutional development. And so then the skeptical answer coming up for theories of sort of agonistic democracy, conflictual understandings of democracy, is, oh, just forget about entitlements. It's all about politics. It's all about what happens in this contingent fight for power in political circumstances. And that, of course, doesn't seem right either, because that seems to do away with normativity too much. It leaves too much to contingent empirical circumstances, saying, no point trying to figure out who the people is. You'll get an answer, just let it fight over them, and the right answer is the one that will just emerge from that fight. So it seemed to us that neither of these is right, neither what we call entitlement conception of the people that says we just come up with a number of criteria that the people should hold. So let's say that we go with an all-affected interests criteria and we say the people is defined by the all-affected interests principle, or we go with an all-subjected interest, so we say the people is whoever is coerced by the same institutions, or we go with a more sort of ethnic culturalist principle, we say the people is whoever shares some cultural characteristics and ethnic characteristics. But all of these are entitlement-based understandings of the people. Or we go with the more, so the alternative that I've just sketched, which is the more agonistic approach, which says, no point worrying about entitlements, just leave it to politics. And it seemed to us that there is a way of trying to mediate between these two perspectives. And it seemed also to us that one can find that mediation by thinking about the role of partisanship in precisely drawing this attempt to mediate, by attending to the nature of partisanship. And why did we think that? Well, because it seems to us that partisanship is a form of political agency, is a kind of civic engagement that connects ideas with real politics, or at least partisans at their best, that's what they're trying to do. So they're trying to connect certain understandings of how should we in principle understand the people to the real problems that there are in society. And so partisans seem to perform this kind of mediating function of they're not purely normative in the sense that they are real political actors, they're real men and women out there, but they have normative commitments, and they have disagreements on these commitments that are principled in the way in which I have just described. So we can incorporate the sort of understanding of entitlement-based conceptions of the people by just making it part of partisan practice. But again, they're not purely, at least in the more ideal defense of the partisanship that I have just sketched, it's not just about power politics. It's not just whoever manages to get more votes is right, or whoever manages to catalyze more money or something like that is right. It's about engagement that is deliberative in form, in the sense that it's arguments that are being made and presented in the public sphere, and it's arguments about a certain ways of understanding the common good. So if we see partisanship as a form of political engagement and a form of political agency that is a catalyzer to good arguments, then we might say, well, it's very difficult to answer the question of peoplehood purely by normative instruments. One should at least consider how these normative arguments are endorsed by political agents that perform the three conditions that either satisfy the three conditions that I have just sketched. But it's also very important that they do that, because precisely that doesn't leave us with a view of politics that is purely agonistic and conflictual, and that doesn't have any normative commitment underpinning it. And it seemed to us, moreover, that if one thinks about how the question of the people has been understood historically, partisanship actually plays a very important role. So in democratic theory, there is a tendency when one studies historically moments of creation of the people to focus on constitutional moments. So the idea that the people is summoned into being when the constitutional is signed, and then that's when we know who the people really is. But if one pays attention, in addition to these moments of constitutional foundation as preceded by acts of partisan politics and followed by partisan politics, then we won't lay our hopes only in the constitutional moments. And that means that the hopes have also less of a chance of being betrayed when the constitutional moments don't happen. So if you think about the European constitutional, for example, constitutional moment, and all the enthusiasm that was gathered around that project and so on, and then at some point it just disappears and one is left with a sense of sort of naive, hopeless optimism that one had and nothing happened afterwards. Whereas instead, if one pays more attention and tries to understand these constitutional moments as both conditioned by partisan politics and ideally also followed by partisan politics, then these moments aren't sort of isolated, and so they're less deceitful when they don't happen, and when they happen, one is more attentive to how they've happened, and so there is more of a chance of carrying that over. So if we think about it in terms of creating the demos in those constitutional moments, it seemed to us that paying attention to the dynamic of partisanship underpinning those constitutional moments will give us something very valuable to reflect upon when thinking about the creation of the people. But it's also very valuable, as I said, even if we don't think of constitutional moments as these moments of synthesis, of positivity, even if we just think of them as in agonistic approaches, as just paradoxical moments, moments where the people is never really captured, it's always happening, people has always been in the making, because it seems to us that if you have this more paradoxical reading of politics that agonistic approaches have, then you really miss the normativity of that process. And so again, it seemed to us that thinking about partisanship as a form of political agency that mediates good normative reasons allows you to move beyond the paradox of politics and to sort of check that paradox and that process in a certain way and in a way that is actually valuable. So there's one caveat on all this, which is to say that if one talks about partisanship, not all parties will be good partisans, and not all partisans will go into good parties. So there is a sense in which one needs to be very careful in qualifying the argument and saying what kind of partisanship is valuable. And it seems that there one has to go more down the route of the sort of normative theory and take more distance from the more agonistic approaches by saying, well, a partisan has at least to be committed to the basic idea of justification. So there is a sense in which one should endorse a reason-giving process which shares certain features of sort of reciprocity and generality. And it's only those partisans that make arguments conditioned by these criteria that are likely to deliver the good results of partisanship. And if there is no commitment to basic justification, if there is no attempt to engage with others by giving good reasons, or if those attempts are simply limited to rhetoric, to power politics, making manipulative moves, and so on, then it's harder to generate, it seems to us, what is valuable about the contribution that partisans make to democratic theory. But if one instead endorses a sort of more idealized version of the party, it seems, and of partisanship, it seems that there will be two functions that partisans will be able to perform. The first one will be the partisan exchange will denaturalize undesirable conceptions of the people, assuming that they are out there. If there is kind of this broad participation of citizens and engagement with partisan politics, these conceptions of the people will be denaturalized, more exclusionary conceptions, let's say, or more, let's say, purely ethnic or purely racist-based conceptions of the people will be denaturalized by exchange with partisans. And on the other hand, one might give strength, support, and strengthen conceptions of the people that one might want to see prosper. So on the one hand, they exercise this denaturalizing function, and on the other hand, they exercise the function of giving more visibility to good ideas. And so it seems to me that this engaging with the defense of partisanship, for the reasons that I have just mentioned, for what parties provide to political agency that other political bodies aren't able to provide by themselves. And this is not to say that it's only parties that do it. Parties in this case might act in concert with other agents like social movements, with deliberative fora. So it's not a defense of the party that is purely focused on the party. It's a defense of the party which says this is what is at the center of our political efforts as citizens, but this can only be improved, not completely destroyed. Thank you very much.